Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Building Stronger Communities, Innovative Workforce Solutions for Economic Development. My name is Audrey Anderson. I'm the Director of Marketing for Golden Shovel Agency. And I want to introduce our esteemed speakers. First, we've got Bethany Quinn, Executive Vice President for Golden Shovel Agency, and Brian Abernathy, the General Manager for Convergent Nonprofit Solutions. We thank you both for joining us today and putting together all this valuable information in our presentation. We also appreciate everyone for joining and taking the time with us. We will be recording this session and sending it out along with a copy of the slides to all of those who have registered. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, add them to the Q&A session and we'll address them as time allows. And before we get too into it, I do want to mention that we also have two more webinars lined up in the next couple of weeks. So first is the benefits of community EV charging and unlocking the economic potential of community airports. So we hope you'll join us for those as well. I'll include links to those in that follow-up email I send to you all. They're also on Golden Shovel's website. So without further ado, let's get started.
All right, thanks, Audrey, and thank you everyone for being here. We appreciate you spending some time with us today. Those of you who join our webinars frequently and download our white papers know that we have been discussing workforce challenges and how to address them for quite some time. This is an issue that has been top of mind for everyone since before the pandemic, escalated obviously since then. But what I'm really excited about today is the ability to bring Convergent to this webinar as well, to share their experience, because for those who are not familiar with Convergent, they do stakeholder engagement all throughout the country with capital campaigns. So they have insight from the very people that you need to support you in your efforts. So I'm very excited to have you here. Brian, is there anything you want to add to that? Or I know you have a lot to share as we go.
Yeah, thanks for that intro, Bethany. It's great to get to be here and talk about this issue because it is really critical across the country, communities large and small that we work in, and it's continuing to change over time. It's been a factor for the last 4 or 5 years, but the dynamics are consistently evolving. And one of the realities that we are seeing as we do feasibility studies and capital campaigns for EDOs across the country is organizations, private sector leaders recognize the critical need to not just address workforce and talent issues today, but to create a pathway that's going to give a sustainable workforce for the future. And they are expecting their economic development organizations and their communities to lead and take the reins in solving that issue. But then at the same time, as we're implementing capital campaigns and securing funding so that those plans can go forward, we've historically benefited greatly from those leaders in the private sector leaning in with their peers and saying, join me in investing in our economic development organization and our economic development professionals to go out and move the needle on these critical issues that will make a difference in our future for our companies and for our community. But today they're so busy because of the workforce constraints in their organizations, they're less able to lean in and provide time to do that type of work. And so just the example of the ripple effects of how this is playing through is really, really interesting. The great news out of all that is that there is still, as we'll share in a few moments, a great amount of funding that is being allocated towards actionable solutions to address workforce needs in communities all across the country.
And that is really good news because everyone on this call, I'm sure, needs money to help fund those initiatives. So we're looking forward to diving into that. So talking about what we'll cover today, again, we're going to go over workforce shortages by the numbers, obstacles to participation, securing resources, aligning initiatives with objectives, funding models, best practices. So we have a lot to cover today. So looking at the numbers as far as what we're seeing in regards to workforce shortages. So it's important, obviously, to use the latest data. This is a report put out by the U.S. Chamber in June, so very recent. It's a very interesting read for those who haven't dove into it, talking about the people who are missing, quote unquote, from the workforce. So it's interesting because there's 8.5 million job openings, 6.5 million people unemployed. But even though there's more people like actually technically working than before the pandemic, the overall share of people that are participating in the workforce has decreased. So if we had the same percentage of workforce participation we did in 2020, we would have 2 million more Americans working. So it's interesting to look at this from a holistic perspective and understand that we're still dealing with a workforce participation issue. I also wanted to look at what's happening in Canada. We do a lot of work in Canada as well. And you see some contradictions, right? Where the Bank of Canada believes that the labor market is coming into balance. Canada Hires is really focused more on the industry specific gaps. So it's important to look at this and know that it's not necessarily that there's going to be workforce shortages in every industry. They are definitely felt more profoundly in certain sectors. So at a local level, it's important for economic developers to speak with major employers and to really narrow down who is struggling, because in order to move that needle, like Brian was talking about, we need to make sure we're bringing the right people into the right communities to fill those skills gaps.
And that sector by sector gap reality is one that it's very easy. We've seen this with some clients recently. It's very easy to focus on those primary sectors for a community, your major manufacturers, whatever it may be, and forget about some of those peripheral services. So it was great to see accommodation and food services called out on that, because there are so many other jobs outside of maybe a top 5 or 6 sector of economic makeup in a community that also need to be filled. And we've seen some great feedback from corporate leaders in a community just recently, vocalizing that reality and ensuring not only that it's spotlighted, but also that it's being addressed by their local economic development organization strategies.
That's a really good point, because it is very easy, as you mentioned, to sometimes only focus on your major employers and forget about all of the companies providing the services to people who are living and working in the community that also need to have support. We have a lot of clients, for example, that are trying to recruit teachers to their communities, right? You can create jobs, you can bring in new families, but that means you need to have teachers at your local schools. So it's important to look at it holistically. So obstacles to workforce participation. So some of these same trends have been pretty consistent over the last few years, but just as a refresher, of retirement, of some people early retiring since COVID, obviously that had a big impact. People delaying getting into the workforce in order to receive their education, family responsibilities, and the continual shortage of childcare providers, and people struggling with disabilities and having challenges from working because of that. Long COVID is still a thing that has taken people out of the workforce. So it is important to acknowledge that are some of the issues at play, and there are some ways to address them. So for example, with education, economic developers working with education and business partners can look at things like putting apprenticeship programs in place and really expanding technical training programs so that people are not in school quite as long, but can still get into a really incredible career. Brian, I know that you've worked on some campaigns that have really focused on the technical training programs that I think you're going to talk about later, but.
Yeah, and this is a great spot to point out the value of our community and technical colleges across the country.
Mm-hmm.
We work with a number of community and technical colleges as well. Their value proposition from an economic development and workforce development standpoint is higher today than maybe it has been in decades. And yet there is still in a lot of communities a gap between how to leverage the capacity of those organizations to meet near-term, in some cases with shorter-term credentialing, almost immediate employer demands. So really, really good thing to remember as a resource.
Oh, absolutely. I know I was interviewing a community and technical college leader in Odessa, Texas, for example. And we were having a great conversation about how she has prioritized even moving things to less time. You know, like what credential can I give someone in 12 weeks? For example, knowing they're going to need continuing education, but what credential can I give them to get them in the workforce, and then, working with the employer to make sure they continue to get those upskills. So it's interesting that people are really getting creative now, and you're absolutely spot on. If you're not working closely with your education partners at that level, this is definitely a time to double down on that engagement. Family responsibilities. Again, the childcare shortage, everyone is aware of this. This has not gone away, but making sure you have a plan in your community to solve it is absolutely necessary, because even if you attract more workers in, if you do not have childcare, you're going to be missing out on at least one parent in that family not being able to fully participate in the workforce. And then in regards to disabilities, as we discussed, there are some people that are finding creative ways to engage talented people who may just need to work differently. I had an excellent conversation with a commissioner from Bergen County, New Jersey yesterday, for example, who they have rolled out a program very successfully that's helped people with autism to engage in meaningful jobs in their communities. And it's a year-long immersive internship program that has been able to place people in hospital settings and in government, and people are really thriving in their careers, but it takes outreach and sometimes a special intentionality to really engage people who don't operate in the exact same way as everyone else, but still can be absolutely incredible resources. So something to definitely keep in mind. All right, I do want to share a little bit of good news though when it comes to workforce participation. So LinkedIn just released this, but there are a lot of people coming out of retirement that have retired in the last couple of years. We have encouraged reaching into this population for things like contract work or consulting work. And that's really what LinkedIn found, is that boomers who have retired are not necessarily coming back into full-time positions, but they are coming back into part-time roles, which of course can also make a big difference for your local business community. So any talent plan should include an area of work that does some outreach to try to plug in people that have a great deal of experience into businesses who maybe don't need somebody full-time, but could really leverage the experience that these boomers do have. Nice to share a little bit of good news on workforce participation for once, right?
Always.
Yeah. Okay, so we know it's time to act, right? We know workforce is such an issue. It's not going away without your help. And all of you on this call are the exact people that are needed in order to solve this problem in your communities. So I gave a couple examples already. I'm excited to share more best practices, but the bottom line is, as economic development community, you guys are super creative and innovative, and we can all learn from each other. So tell us more about what you're seeing, Brian.
Yeah, there are historically gaps in a lot of communities where organizations, as I mentioned before, community colleges, economic development organizations, employers, the transition points between those organizations have sort of naturally worked out. If you go back even into recent history, the person who wants to be a welder is going to go enroll in welding school, and then they're going to go find the job where they can be a welder if they don't already have a connection there. And so those siloed, for lack of a better word, realities weren't as much of an issue, but as the constraints that we're dealing with today are in place, there is much more of a realization to cultivate a workforce ecosystem. Businesses are not able to solve their needs on their own. Education and training organizations are not able to recruit and engage the trainees and students that they want to have in their programs the way that they have wanted to in the past and been able to in the past. Interestingly, a lot of the same realities that are keeping people out of the workforce, family, all the variables, Bethany, that you just mentioned, are also constraints for people enrolling in education and further credentials. So a lot of the same issues are affecting these different sectors. And looking at that ecosystem is really critical. Everyone's constraints are limited. The business and industry sector don't have the capacity to go out and do all of the things that they would like to do in their communities, more proactively partnering with their EDOs and other community partners because they're short-staffed. We have seen in our work with clients across the country that typically our clients are short-staffed as well. So you want to fund and bring in a new workforce focused team member at your EDO. Well, until you get that person, you can't really go out and focus on the work the way that you want to. So the constraints are impacting everyone. And the big thing that we've seen is everyone is focused on what their critical bottom line need or hurdle is. But in order to resolve this issue community-wide and really nationally, we've got to understand how those different needs are all part of the same broader complex issue. This is not so easy because everyone is appropriately focused on their critical need. Manufacturers are focused on controlling their overhead cost. The community and technical college is focused on driving enrollment. I believe economic development organizations are very uniquely positioned to serve as a connection point across those different community partners because they understand the language, they understand the value proposition, and they can bring a common knowledge, common vernacular and focus on addressing the big issue while also making sure that those core individual needs are met. As we mentioned, all of these gaps need to be connected, and EDOs are just so uniquely positioned to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, EDOs see things from that bird's eye view, and economic developers are skilled at creating long-term plans to help solve these issues. So that makes a lot of sense.
We have the great opportunity to interface with, over the course of each year, literally thousands of corporate leaders in the communities in which we're working. And in our feasibility studies, just over the last year, talent is consistently among the top priorities from private sector leaders that we are meeting with. In some cases, it comes up as a top priority, even outside of the pre-existing focus areas for the client we're working with. Right now, of the economic development organizations that we're working with, 76% of them have talent and workforce as core components of their strategic plan for which we're actively raising funding. The really interesting reality, the other 24% out of the group that we're working with currently are regional organizations where they do not address talent. There are other entities that are proactively addressing that. So you could almost say that every organization that we are working with that is in a position to be able to address talent has it as a core component of what they're doing. Right now, it represents almost 40% of the funding that we are working to secure for organizations across the country, which is much more than it has historically been. We're seeing talent and workforce being separated and called out in unique areas. We're seeing things like childcare, things like housing being brought into the discussion because of the implication that it has on the workforce and talent realities in those communities.
Yeah, and I think that it's so important to have your insight on this because really from an economic developer perspective, right? This is something that you know that has to be solved. But this comes down to that whole concept of putting your money where your mouth is, and you're actually speaking with people who are writing the checks. So it sounds like what you're saying is that the people writing the checks are very intentionally wanting to give money to talent-related campaigns.
Absolutely. And some of that plays back to that core individual focus or need. When you are looking at your bottom line realities as a employer and they're limited because of workforce, it is worth investing in a solution to that workforce constraint, understanding that it's going to drive bottom line results that ultimately you're going to be held accountable for. So it's absolutely there, and it's bleeding over even into other sectors of the community. We do a great amount of work with YMCA's, Boys and Girls Clubs, and other community organizations, and they are being, I say pulled in, but now included in the conversation around workforce and around talent because they provide avenues for career exposure for students and avenues for safe and reliable places for kids to be after school so their parents can work. It's really interesting to see the way this particularly acute need has broadened collaboration, where, again, historically, it was not what we experienced when we're on the ground talking with leaders in communities.
Yeah, so very powerful shift if we're at the point where people are willing to financially invest in this change.
Yep, and that's the key, is folks want to see results. We hear so much of solve this issue, tell us what it takes, tell us what you need, but the future of our community, the future of our business and local economy is contingent upon the reality of workforce and talent. And so in many areas, we are seeing private sector leaders say, you show us how you'll deliver the results, and we will fund the solutions that will get us where we need to get. And everyone recognizes this is not something that's going to be resolved in 6, 12, 18 months. In many cases, we're raising funding on 4 and 5 year funding cycles. And even looking 4 and 5 years out into the future, private sector leaders understand this is a long play solution. We can fix some things near term, but these organizations, foundations, even public sector funders are doubling down on the urgency of funding today with a long-term perspective and commitment, knowing that it is going to take many, many years to catch up to the demand that's in place. And again, it's that recognition of the complexity of this issue and the need for stakeholders to be aligned. And as I've said already, they're going to economic developers in their community saying, you're connected to all of the key players. Show us what needs to happen. Show us how you can move the needle. And then we'll give you what you need to go out there and deliver the results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And speaking about doing what it takes to drive results, let's go over some best practices, which include some from the campaigns that you have been working on. So I don't know if anyone has listened to this podcast. It just came out, I think, a week or two ago, but was able to interview Lindsay Rubinek from 100 Meridian Immigration, a very interesting company and projects they've been working on. They've been working on resettling families in the Canadian prairies. So some of these communities are very rural. There's an example here of a community of 7,000. We spoke about a community of 700. And they have been successfully bringing people in who are immigrating to Canada. And a really cool story to share is when the war broke out in Ukraine, there was a local business person who decided to make a donation to get something rolling to help resettle families. And the community participated by, giving additional donations of furniture and supplies and some funding as well. And somebody volunteered to be a relocation liaison to help find housing and resettle them. And over 200 people have moved to this community of 7,000 because of this program, all run by volunteers. So that's not something that can be done everywhere, but again, it's just the power of people in a community coming together to help solve this problem, a problem that people are obviously experiencing for their own families, and making sure that they were able to have a better life and get great jobs and really be settled in these communities. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of is on-site childcare, bringing parents back to work, with businesses actually opening the childcare facilities themselves. The trend that we're seeing is they are willing to put money into opening it. They do not want to run it. And that's where economic developers really need to come in, is finding local people to run the community. This one example of Tyson, they worked with KinderCare, which obviously is a national brand. But most of the communities, it's not national brands coming in to run these childcare facilities. It's someone who had an in-home daycare, who has the expertise locally, who's able to then take it to the next level and run their daycare out of a business in a much larger footprint.
A great example I'll share on that point, Bethany, was speaking at a Boys and Girls Club conference for their West Coast leadership last year. And an executive mentioned that in their community, a commercial developer came to him and said, we're putting in a new mixed-use development, and we want the Boys and Girls Club to locate a facility in this development. there may be great philanthropic drive behind that, but I guarantee you there's also a perspective of a safe, reliable place for children to have access to positive adult engagement and not be getting into trouble while their parents are able to work and fill the jobs in that mixed use development is an upside for that developer. They're going to be able to fill more storefronts, sell more condos, whatever it was that they were going to put in, because they had a credible, recognized, and consistently present community partner that could provide a critical need that they did not want to get into providing on their own.
And that's a great example. And that's the type of thing that we're seeing throughout the country, right? Is people that have the funds or have the space are often willing to put it towards this issue, but they know they're not good at running childcare facilities. That's not the business they are in. And that's where economic developers really need to connect the dots and bring people together to create that solution holistically.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing people are having success with is recruiting military veterans. There's been a lot of changes in the past decade that have helped to match skills that people have when they're in service and how those actually translate to the private sector. In North Carolina, they're having a lot of success with hiring events where they're offering jobs on the spot and making those direct employer connections. So if you have a base that's near your community within a couple hours drive, we definitely recommend that economic developers take a more proactive role in working with their business communities and at minimum participating in on-base job fairs, because they do have those job fairs throughout the year.
Grants are another great opportunity. And one of the important things to keep in mind with grants is not just getting a grant that will fund a temporary horizon of work, but the ability to leverage those grants as a starting point for broader community investment and impact. The Fargo-Moorhead West Fargo Chamber in North Dakota was awarded an EDA Good Jobs Challenge grant, helping expand their support and wraparound services. They recognize that grant was not going to last forever. And if you've ever looked at EDA grants, they are complex to submit and apply for, but they offer significant opportunity. And in this case, the Chamber, in partnership with their local economic development organization, is leveraging this investment in workforce development along with numerous others as a catalyst to drive increased investment and increased impact in the talent and workforce need in their community through a broader $23 million capital campaign. So thinking about the flywheel effect, what can get things moving, and then how can you accelerate and expand the impact? Grants can be great opportunities, and those are available at many levels, not just EDA.
Yeah, that's a great example. And they're going to have a lot of money to put towards talent between the combination of that capital campaign and the EDA grant.
Absolutely.
All right. One thing to consider is just making sure that your community is a place where people want to work, and seeing if there's a way to carve out a specific niche that you could be known for. This is just an example of making a community known for their creative assets, right? So the city of Oil City, they've been attracting artists for over a decade, and they offer a lot of unique things like flexible zoning and tax abatements and studio space. But the thing to remember is that a lot of times when someone moves to your community, they're going to move with your family. So even if you are launching a campaign such as this, that might not put somebody with one of your major employers, they're going to bring potentially a partner with them who can. So if you have some assets that you don't feel are 100% match for just what your major employers are looking for, that doesn't mean that you can't run a really cool campaign that's still going to attract people to your community and end up placing people in those jobs anyway. So think through your assets and get creative.
Another creative asset that can be put in place in communities, and a great barrier to remove for a credentialed workforce. We love the story of the Greenwood Promise. Promise programs, as you're probably aware, are last dollar scholarship programs. This one for Greenwood County, South Carolina, a county of about 70,000. Through 2 funding cycles, they raised $9 million for scholarship funds to send Greenwood students to school locally in the community. In that time frame, they've seen a 13% upswing in the number of their high school graduates pursuing post-secondary education. That has taken them from the bottom third of counties in South Carolina to second in the state in a 5-year period. So creating a pathway to put people on a track to a job at a local employer is great. This was launched out of their local economic development organization. So this was or is the perfect example of an EDO saying, hey, we need to find a solution, and we may not be the ones to deliver it, but we can make sure that it's here and present in our community. And of course, when you're attracting a workforce to move to your area, to be able to share with them that their kids can graduate from high school and go to college for basically free is a pretty good selling point as well.
Oh, absolutely. No, that's such a fantastic success story. And it's great that you have that historic data to demonstrate how they have moved up in the state rankings as well. All right. Springfield, Ohio is a mutual client of ours. We both support the Greater Springfield Partnership, and their talent attraction campaign was unique because they realized they had people living in the community. They just weren't necessarily working there. They were commuting out. And so when you're looking at putting a talent attraction campaign together, that's one of the things that you need to look at first, right? Because it's a lot easier to convince someone who already lives in your community to stop commuting than to necessarily convince someone to move. So that often begins with a marketing campaign to create awareness, simply because if you have done an incredible job as an economic developer, bringing more jobs to your community, growing your economy over the past decade, for example, someone who maybe started their career 10 years ago plus may not be aware just because they haven't looked for a job in your community lately. So a lot of times that comes down to marketing and communication. Anything you want to add to this one, Brian, since you guys work with them too?
Yeah, that how to get our local folks working in our local community comes up frequently. The marketing piece is so critical because it is most of the time just a factor of people not realizing, individual workers and families not realizing the opportunity that may be 15, 20, 45 minutes, maybe even an hour or more closer to home, which is going to give them quality of life impact as well. And so lots of great upside on that ability to leverage local workforce with local jobs that I think oftentimes is just easy to miss without the right awareness. And you can't find a better example of focusing on that in the Springfield Partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. They're doing an incredible job.
Roanoke is another great example of attraction, but maybe in a little bit different way versus getting local folks to work locally. The Roanoke Regional Partnership does a phenomenal job of leveraging their regional assets from a natural resource standpoint to attract and grow their workforce. If you've been through Roanoke, like many communities around the United States and North America, it's a beautiful place. And they leverage that outdoor appeal, outdoor activities, specifically to attract folks. Then they collaborate intentionally with education and workforce so that they're aligning education programs with workforce needs. And they've used all of this to foster increased diversity in their community civic and business leadership, which there's a great wealth of research that can be found to show how that creates long-term thriving for communities, not just at an economic standpoint, but also just from a family and individual well-being. Seeing communities grow and thrive is so much more natural and statistically stable when you've got a strong base of diverse and engaged civic leadership.
Yeah, absolutely.
Macon is another one of our favorite examples. They leveraged a majority of funding through a $3 million campaign a few years ago to focus in on workforce. If you're familiar with Georgia geography, Macon is very down close to what we call the Nat line, which is the threshold for Southern Georgia. And they were seeing a great deal of their workers moving towards Metro Atlanta and even commuting up to Metro Atlanta from Macon. The chamber created Greater Career Works, integrating in an online platform employer, educator, and potential worker realities, the needs, the capacities, and creating a common point for all of them to come together. I love an explanation I heard from one of their team members. We knew we had jobs, we knew we had people training, and we knew we had people sitting at home that were unemployed. We just had to figure out how to connect the gaps between the three, and they have done that phenomenally. And they've also leveraged their resources with Choose Macon to help some of their core industry sectors recruit and attract the staff and the roles that they need that had over time been leaving the area and going to other metro areas in the state of Georgia.
Yeah, connecting those gaps is so important, and it does take a lot of work. So one of the other things that we're seeing, of course, is the idea of recruiting people that are in your community, the youth that are in high school, right before they leave. What can we do to get them interested in jobs, especially in rural communities? So a couple ideas that we'll cruise through here. Rural Minnesota SEP, their Big Idea Roadshow, they take a mobile learning lab. And so that way students can exit the classroom and they can get into the lab, put on their VR goggles, what have you, and experience what it's like to work in different industries. So very cool. We see a lot of events and tours around Manufacturing Day to expose youth to local companies. It's impossible for someone to understand what it might be like to work in an environment if they have no exposure to it. So this is something that doesn't just have to happen with local manufacturers. Finding out what types of careers students are interested in and making sure employers are open and welcoming to giving tours, maybe having people come and shadow, is an excellent way to create interest and get people set up for future internships, as an example. We have a lot of clients that are working to increase exposure through VR because it isn't always possible to set up those shadowing opportunities and those tours, especially in any facilities that are secure or may require, background checks. Things like hospitals, for example, it can be really difficult to get students to come in because that's, of course, needing to be a secure environment. So using VR is a great way. I mean, you can get those tours done virtually and anyone can watch it at any time to gain that exposure. And of course, our Place VR division does that quite well.
Exposure is a great point to remember. I have partnered with a rural effort in Georgia personally called the Georgia Rural Collaborative Coalition, talking about exposing students to opportunities and career pathways they might not be aware of. And what many in that group say over and over is if they can't see it, they won't be it. And just letting students see and know the opportunity that is before them. And then showing them the pathway to how to get that training. A great example of creating those training pathways is the Chamber of Lawrence in Kansas. This example, I would say they were addressing need ahead of their time in terms of what we're seeing today across the country. This is a several years old example, but the Chamber, in a collaboration with 6 auto dealers, the city, the county, and their public schools, helped to expand the auto technician program at Peasley Technical College there in the community. This is a great example of addressing critical felt needs for each individual party. Chambers and EDOs love to see the economy grow. Public sector love to see the economy grow because of the tax impact, because of the stability that it brings. Schools love to see their students transitioning into careers, and technical schools love to see folks trained and enrolled in their program. And this checked the boxes on all of those. And again, it brought into play that alignment of all the right partners in the community, and it catalyzed great investment. There was $600,000 invested in this specific program out of a broader economic development capital campaign the Chamber was going through at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. In auto tech, I've heard that in conversations repeatedly. That's one of those positions people don't talk about a lot, but at the local level, there's such a shortage of talent. So many people that are going to be retiring. It's actually a major issue.
And it is not it is a high-tech field these days.
Yeah.
It really is not just turning a wrench. It is computer engineering even in some areas from what I've heard.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a whole new world. Speaking of internships, IndieFluence is a pretty cool program, if anyone is unfamiliar with it. So their internship program is designed to retain interns and keep college students, who graduate in Indianapolis. Really cool website online. I recommend that you go and check it out. But they make it so that it's not just an internship, but being plugged into the community. So you're getting mentored from local leaders. There's tours of the city and different community partners. They have fun special events, which helps to build connections between the interns themselves. And they're really active on social media just to kind of create this buzz and ecosystem about how cool it is to be an intern in Indianapolis. And then obviously the goal, the aim is to make sure these students continue to work in the community afterwards. And that's one of the things that I think we need to remember in economic development is we're really good at putting together programs of work. We're not always really good at having fun. So we need to sometimes find ways to make these talent campaigns more engaging and fun for the participants, because it's more likely they'll sign up and tell their friends, which then by word of mouth will continue to increase participation in your programs.
A couple great examples, this and the next from North Carolina. The Raleigh Chamber and Wake County Economic Development. They leverage the Work in the Triangle program. They target key industry sectors, healthcare being one of those, and other metro areas where there may be available workforce or folks who might like a different quality of life dynamic to do targeted attraction. They also provide a regional skills analysis survey, have over 1,000 local industry partners and businesses that participate in that. They use all of this to drive an equitable approach to economic development, which again breeds sustainability. It breeds a vibrant community that people want to move to, want to be a part of. And if you've been to Raleigh anytime recently, you know that it is in fact a very vibrant and growing community. And this was funded through the Edge 6 and Edge 7 capital campaigns, funding their economic development. And then not too far over in the state of North Carolina, the Greensboro Chamber is our next example. One of my favorite examples of addressing workforce as an ecosystem. I'm a little bit biased because I got to manage one of the campaigns that funded the GROW initiative, which is their economic development programming. They are doing a phenomenal job in Greensboro of collaborating across different sectors with the Chamber, Action Greensboro, which is their community engagement arm, the local community foundation, a handful of other foundations in the area, and their workforce board. You can look at Guilford Works. They have very targeted objectives around percentage of their community to be credentialed by 2030. And they understand what role each organization in the community plays, and they're aligned to do what each organization does best so that they're moving that needle. I have to spotlight that this is such a great example of not caring about who gets credit, but caring about solving the problem. And they have had no hurdles in raising the funding to solve that problem. Oftentimes, nonprofits can get caught up in, oh, if it's not us, we need to get the funding. Believe me, the funding is out there. If you can show the alignment to solve the problem, you're not going to have to fight over the funding. And this is just a phenomenal example of how that alignment not only attracts the funding, but also delivers very clear, measurable results.
Yeah, that's great. And a really good point that sometimes you need to work with your nonprofit partners in order to secure all the funding that you need. And quite frankly, as long as everyone's working towards the same goal, it doesn't really matter.
That's right.
One of the things that we're seeing be very effective is offering diverse incentives. So Montgomery County Action Council, for example, they launched a Love Montgomery County campaign where people can apply to get funds to help pay their student loans or provide down payment assistance or help with relocation if they are to take a job with a local employer and to move into the community. So the reason why this is, of course, a really effective example is because if you do have a bucket of money that you can put towards town attraction and getting people into the community, offering the opportunity for them to decide how they would like that money to be used can be a wise idea, right? Because some people might not have student loans. Some people may only just need help moving to your community. They're not going to pay for the moving vehicle and everything that's going to come with that. But if you can offer those flexible incentives, it allows for you to have conversations with folks and really determine what they need. An example, of course, that's great for an incentive is in Forward Devils Lake. They help to pay off student loan debt through a partnership with employers. Employers pay for part of it, the community pays for part of it. So of course that does continue to be a very popular incentive. There's also a lot of communities that have been offering cash incentives to relocate for remote workers. This is something, obviously, people talked a lot about it in Tulsa a couple of years ago. Shoals, Alabama is also doing that. So sometimes you can raise money that actually goes directly to the people that you're trying to recruit as well. So something to consider. Building more housing, of course, is going to remain important because you have to have places for them to live. Greater Fremont Development Council. I share this example often just because years ago, before everybody was panicking about housing, they raised money from the local community for a housing fund to provide gap financing for developers. And that made a huge impact on them with over 1,000 housing starts happening as a result of that program. So they are one of the communities that actually has longstanding data now on how that can be effective. Of course, even at the smaller level, there are communities like Phelps County, Nebraska, who are working with local employers to provide down payment assistance so that way people can get into a house, once it is, of course, built. So they pay for part of it and the employer pays for part of it. We talked earlier about making opportunities for people with all levels of abilities. So I would definitely make sure you're working with your nonprofit partners on those initiatives. Those aren't necessarily things that economic developers will spearhead on their own, but strike up those conversations and see if you can make matches between the nonprofits and education partners and business leaders who would benefit from that talent. Of course, working with your partners on help with recruiting is going to be really important. In Montgomery County, Ohio, they go to where people are with their mobile unit. So think community fair, Bay Outdoor Concert, what have you, set up shop, because sometimes it's easier to go to people than have them come to you. And then once there, they help with getting them set up with training and resumes and things of that nature. And speaking of funding training, of course, as we discussed earlier, supporting the work your community and technical college is doing is very wise. In some cases, you may need to work with business leaders to develop your own program. That's what Greater Gallup did when they worked on a construction program that was 10 weeks of developing specific skills and also being placed with an employer. And that program was the result of requests made by their employers locally. So at times, economic developers do need to take things into their own hands and put those programs together. The other thing to address, Brian mentioned wraparound services earlier. Transportation is still something that needs to be part of those conversations. You may have folks who would love to take a job, but don't have a ride. So in certain cases, like in Western Iowa, economic developers have come together to actually put transportation solutions in place. There may be grants available that can help with that at the state and county level. We are seeing some funding for that. Is transportation something that you're discussing on wraparound services, Brian?
It comes up more and more and varies by community, but absolutely the ability to get workers to the jobs, particularly in smaller and more rural communities, is a critical barrier. If you've got a larger metro area that's got a transportation system, sometimes there are complaints about that transportation system, but it is there. Rural communities are having to address this in a very different way. And it is absolutely a collaborative approach to a solution, because my guess is there's no EDO in the country that wants to start its own bus line.
Right. No, there typically isn't. But again, this was a creative solution. The Region 12 Council of Governments supported a transportation shuttle solution because it had to be done, right? And I think that's something that I always see from the economic development community is sometimes we come up with solutions and things just because there's nobody else to do it. So I guess the bottom line is if you are having conversations with your business community and funders, if transportation is an issue, there are some solutions that can be put in place and people are willing to consider that from a funding perspective. Also, just a reminder, if you're trying to reach workers, you need to make sure to go where they are. So in addition to being in person, a digital ad campaign is of course very key because people spend so much of their time online, especially younger workers. You know, Gen Z, for example, they're spending so much time. People who have TikTok are spending like 6 hours a day. That's the latest stats. So we're running a lot of ads and videos on TikTok because that's where they are. So it's important to have a digital aspect to any campaign. And we do also always recommend a workforce ambassador program where you are getting people in your community who love your community to talk about why they love living and working there and to share their success online with their friends and invite them to connect with local employers. The more formal of a program it is, the better, just because you have a group of people you can share information with and expect them to put it out there. We recommend encouraging participation through things like giving away gift cards and public recognition, and of course, fun events. That was a lot.
Lots of good examples in there, and a great breakdown of the complexity of the talent and workforce ecosystem right now.
Yeah, and we're open to questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, Bethany and Brian. Not seeing any questions yet, but if anyone has any that they've thought of, toss them in the Q&A right now and we can address a couple. We have a couple minutes left until the top of the hour.
While they're doing that,
Yep.
Brian, if anyone is on this webinar and it's like, yes, we absolutely need to tackle this, we don't have any money, what do they do?
Visit convergentnonprofit.com and we'll be happy to talk with you about what your needs are. We can talk through the dynamics of your funding history, the makeup of your community, and so forth, and help come up with the right approach to go out and validate what funding may be there. Typically, that's through a feasibility study, but we're happy to talk through where you're at and what the best fit would be based on each community and organization's needs. But there is money to be raised for this right now, for sure.
I'll put in a little plug for Golden Shovel too. We put this white paper together not too long ago. So definitely take some time to download that. We've also got a ton of workforce articles on our website. So if you go to the news section and search, there you can search by keywords and find the workforce keyword. You'll find tons of great articles that we've written recently and over the past several years.
Yeah, and Audrey, there was a question in regards to the white paper. Are you going to be emailing it out, or do you want to put the link in the chat?
I can do both.
Perfect. And obviously at Golden Shovel, we create workforce attraction campaigns on a daily basis. We would love to work with you as well. If you have any questions in regards to how we can help, please reach out. Just happy to have a conversation. And thank you all for being here today. We appreciate your time.